Good morning. I am Midshipman Second Class Trevor Wall of the University of Oklahoma Navy ROTC program. I am a junior at the University of Oklahoma, and I will receive my degree in criminology. It is my honor to introduce today's first keynote speaker, Dr. Mark Lewis, Executive Director of the National Defense Industrial Association's Emerging Technologies Institute. Formerly, Dr. Lewis was a Director of Defense Research and Engineering in the Department of Defense, overseeing technology modernization for all services and DoD agencies, as well as the Acting Deputy under the Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering. Additionally, he has served on the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board. Dr. Lewis attended the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where he received his Bachelor of Science in Aeronautics and Astronautics, Bachelor of Science in Earth and Planetary Science, and Master of Science and Doctor of Science in Aeronautics and Astronautics. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Mark Lewis.
I'm also going to be lowering the microphone. So as I was getting ready to get on the airplane to come here, my wife, who by the way was born in Oklahoma City, but my wife says, "Oh, so tell me a little bit about this meeting." I said, "It's going to be great. We're going to be in a natural history museum surrounded by dinosaurs and fossils." She said, "Oh, wonderful. You'll fit in well." So, sorry, I've been waiting all morning for that one. But she also asked, "What are you going to talk about?" And I, went through my standard talking point. She said, "Okay, try not to get them all depressed first thing in the morning. But I'm going to warn you, I'm going to get you a little bit depressed, but hopefully not. I'll bring it back at the end, because I'm going to be talking about a very serious subject that we've already heard some comments about, and that is this technology race that I think we are in. Let me give you some perspective. At the end of World War II, as the United States emerged from the war, the United States was responsible for roughly 50% of the total investment in science and technology around the world. And of that, roughly 50% of that investment was Department of Defense investment. So that meant the US DoD was responsible for roughly 25% of the entire world's investment in science and technology. Today, the number is closer to about 4%. Still a really large number, but obviously much smaller in comparison. And the reason isn't that we've stopped investing, it's that other people have stepped up in investing. That's other countries around the world, and it's also investments in the private sector. So that's the reality of the world that we live in. And that means the department needs to be leveraging activities, efforts, investments in the private sector more than ever before. Now, that isn't to say that the department isn't still making large investments. And just for perspective, the total S&T dollars that the Pentagon spends, roughly in the neighborhood of about $110 to $115 billion a year. That's 3 times larger than the next largest federal agency, National Institutes of Health. Right? By comparison, the NASA budget's about $25 billion a year. National Science Foundation, that's only about $8 billion a year, although looking to get a significant plus up in pending legislation. So the Department of Defense is the big dog on the block, and I would argue that that's frankly the way it should be. And for the very simple reason that I'll also argue the American way of war currently depends and has in the past always depended on the principle of technological superiority. Now, here's where I give you the disclaimer. I'm not a historian, I'm an engineer, but I hang out with historians. It's a good idea because they always get the last word, so you want to be on the right side of historians. But I'll point out that if you go back to the earliest days of our nation, technological prowess, technological superiority was at the forefront of our defense planning. The first frigates in the American Navy were designed to be technologically superior to anything else on the oceans at the time. And it's an amazing story. You may know that one of those frigates remains the USS Constitution up in Boston, and it was a technological marvel in almost every way you look at it. Materials, design, armament, but also a marvel because of the people who manned it. It was an all volunteer crew, people who actually wanted to be on board, and it talks to the importance of having a well-trained workforce. Fast forward, during the Civil War, we saw the introduction of ironclad ships in the U.S. Navy. By the way, I need to step aside. I'm an Air Force guy through and through, but so apologies for the Navy, to my Air Force brethren. Apologies for all the Navy stories, but there wasn't an Air Force during the Civil War. Sorry. So The development of ironclad ships in both the Confederate and the U.S. Navy. Again, an amazing story of bringing new technology. This is something the United States brought to bear. It was mentioned earlier, stealth technology, another example of technological superiority. And those of us who remember the first night of the air war over Baghdad and saw the incredible accomplishments of the investments that we made in stealth technology understand the importance. More recently, precision munitions, and even the way that the U.S. military uses space and how integral it is to everything that we do, but the capabilities that space gives us. So again, technology is important, and the people, the men and women who use that technology, also important. But the reality is we've also missed the boat a number of times, right? We invented the airplane. We entered World War I having to fly other people's airplanes. Now, there are reasons for that, not the least of which is the Wright brothers, after they invented the airplane, proceeded to sue everyone who tried to build something that looked like their airplane. But the reality is we didn't have that technology available, and we were borrowing other people's airplanes. And it happened again. Radar, we missed the boat on radar. The gas turbine engine. So the gas turbine engine was invented by Frank Whittle in England. He was 23 years old when he invented it, by the way. So any students in the audience, if you haven't done anything great by the age of 23, you haven't lived up to Frank Whittle standards. But while the British were actually implementing a gas turbine engine, we had a distinguished panel of experts sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences that concluded conclusively that there was no reason to invest in gas turbine engines. They held no future promise for aviation. And of course, you know the end of that story. Even rockets. We had Robert Goddard inventing liquid fuel rockets out in a field in Worcester, Massachusetts. But the first implementation wasn't the US implementation. It was a German implementation. It was the V2 rocket. Quite an amazing advance. So the bottom line is we can't rest on our laurels. And we can't even assume that just because we invented technology, we're the ones who are going to see it through. I submit to you that in following up on some comments that were made earlier, we are presently at risk of losing the lead in a number of key technology areas. Microelectronics is one, and we've offshored manufacturing to such an extent that we're dependent on microelectronic supply chains. I'd also argue that the department has made some decisions in the past that have resulted in our buying microelectronics, the department buying microelectronics that are not state-of-the-art. And we have peer competitors who can buy state-of-the-art. Now, of course, recently we saw the passing of the CHIPS Act, really important piece of legislation, trying to get manufacturing back into the United States. But still, this is an area at risk, and we know that the Chinese are investing very, very heavily to build a microelectronics capability. Space. We consider ourselves to be the undisputed leaders in space. The Chinese are doing more launches than we are. They have their eyes on landing on the moon. And what's the impact of that? Well, if you can land on the moon, you can do other things in space. As President Kennedy said over 60 years ago. Telecommunications. We led the world in developing standards for 4G. The Chinese led the world in leading the standards for 5G. And so again, an area that they're leading. Other areas that we worry about, artificial intelligence. I think we still have the lead, but we're seeing the Chinese moving very quickly. And the scary thing is, I don't know about you, but I have no confidence in them applying the same ethical limits to artificial intelligence that we do. Same thing in biotechnology. We know that the Chinese are investing very heavily in biotechnology. I have no confidence in their applying those same ethical standards that we do. And even in quantum science, we know that the Chinese are making big investments. About 2 days ago, I was reading Motor Trend magazine. And they had an article about a car that's now being produced in China. It's called the Xpeng P7. It's basically their version of the Tesla. And Motor Trend magazine gave this car an amazing review. They said it was an incredible piece of technology. And they pointed out the scary fact, or it's scary to me, that this is a company that first started producing cars in 2019. And so here we are in 2022, and they've got a car that Motor Trend says rivals the Tesla Model S. Let that sink in. Although the article didn't say so, I'm sure there was some industrial espionage involved in that, as we know China is wont to do. Here's the contrast, by the way. So the Toyota company started building cars again after World War II. Their first foray into the US market was 1958. By 1960, they had to pull their cars because they were such poor quality, and they didn't re-enter the market until the 1970s. The Hyundai Corporation from South Korea, they were founded in 1967. It wasn't until 1986 that they entered the US market, And their product was really a really poor car, but it was a low-cost car. That's how they entered. Now here you contrast it to a Chinese company that starts in 2019, and they're ready to try to enter the US market in 2022 with a car whose quality rivals that of some of the best electric vehicles. So that's the competitor that we're facing. There are a couple of areas that I didn't mention already because I think those are areas, see, I told you I was going to get you depressed. It's going to get worse. A couple of areas where I think we've already lost the lead. One is the area that I've spent most of my research career in, that is hypersonics, and Secretary Xu mentioned hypersonics. By any metric that I can construct, China is now ahead of us in this area. And I say that definitively because they have already deployed systems. They've shown them to us. They've done parades down their main streets showing off their hypersonic capabilities. We're still doing science, technology, research and development. We have some active programs. But our first deployed system will be a US Army system, hopefully in 2023. And then other systems follow after that. They've already deployed. The Russians have also already deployed. Putin has been bragging about this. They used hypersonic weapons already in Ukraine. They didn't work very well, not because they were hypersonic, because the Russians didn't engineer them very well. But still, we're seeing another a country that's obviously leapfrogged us. Directed energy, that's another one where by almost any metric I can construct, we have Chinese systems that are deployed ahead of our systems. And even in communications, they're able to use next-G communications in ways they have exceeded some of our capabilities. So this is obviously a concern. Some have suggested that we're at the risk of igniting another arms race. I will submit to you, we're already in an arms race. Whether we choose to run in that race or not, we are in that arms race. And in no area is that more clear than in the realm of hypersonics. So let me step back and say, how did we fall behind in an area where we were the clear leader, right? And I'll come back to, hypersonics is a field that the United States basically invented, right? In 1948, the first hypersonic man-made object was launched. It was a sounding rocket that was mounted on top of a captured V-2 rocket. It was launched out at White Sands, reached 6 times the speed of sound, and so that's how we generally credit as the first human-made hypersonic object. Throughout the 1960s, the United States led. NASA and the Air Force and the Navy had a program called the X-15. It was an experimental rocket plane. 3 were built, 1 crashed, 2 remain. One's at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Side note, if you haven't been to Dayton, Ohio, you need to go just to go see the Air Force Museum. The other is in the Aerospace Museum in Washington, D.C. The X-15 flew 199 times, mostly into the realm of, into the hypersonic envelope. It holds multiple records, including the human speed record in the atmosphere, Mach 6.7. It was set by a pilot named Pete Knight back in 1967. Pete's son, Steve Knight, was a member of Congress for a few years, representing the district that included Edwards Air Force Base, where his father did that flight. And he would often say that if his father were still alive, he would be really upset to know that he still holds the speed record in the atmosphere in that X-15 vehicle. In 2004, NASA flew the first hypersonic vehicle that was powered by a supersonic combustion ramjet. The engine we see as being the solution to flying in the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. They did it again later in the year 2004. They flew that vehicle to almost 10 times the speed of sound. That was followed in 2010 by an Air Force program, the X-51, one I'm particularly proud of. I had a hand in that when my first time in the Pentagon. X-51 was able to fly finally for 210 seconds under jet power in the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. When it was flying in those conditions, it was traveling a mile per second. And the amazing thing about X-51 is it had every element that you would need for a fully capable weapon. It looked like a missile. That was last flight of that was 2013. What did we do after those programs? Well, NASA flew that X-43. They were successful. They got to Mach 10. They high-fived, and they canceled the program. I was there for that flight. We were at Edwards Air Force Base. And I can tell you the celebration after the fact, after the flight, was the most depressing celebration I've ever been to. Here was a team of people who had just pulled off the impossible. They had accomplished something incredible. And then they were all going to be scattered to the 4 winds because we were no longer going to be investing in this area. NASA is not alone in that. X-51. We flew it 4 times. 2 were successful. The 4th flight was so successful that the most amazing thing I can tell you about it is the flight was boring because it matched every prediction we had made on the performance of the vehicle. You took the flight data, you compared it to all of our modeling and simulation, and the data points lined up absolutely spot on. What did we do? We ended the program. In fact, we did even worse. We handed the program over to DARPA. DARPA picked up the program and said, you know, we don't do other people's technology. We do new stuff. We invent new technology. So they started all over again. And about roughly a year ago, we had the first flights of a program called HAWK, the Hypersonic Advanced Weapon Concept, which is the logical follow-on to X-51. But that was a decade after we flew X-51. The story isn't much better in our test facilities. So recently there's been a big call for investing in test facilities, wind tunnels and flight test. Today, if you want to do an experiment in a national hypersonic test facility, you will be waiting 30 months. That is our backlog. So how do you make progress when you've got a 2.5-year wait just to do an experimental test on your new configuration? I spent most of my career as a faculty member at the University of Maryland. We were down the road from a facility that the Air Force now operates. It is a wind tunnel called Hypervelocity Wind Tunnel Number 9. It's an amazing facility. It can deliver speeds up to almost 18 times the speed of sound. It's one of the nation's most capable wind tunnels. Why is it called Hypervelocity Wind Tunnel Number 9? Well, as you can guess, that's because there were 8 wind tunnels that preceded it. Tunnel number 1 was built by Dr. Wernher von Braun. He built it at Peenemünde. And after the war, there was, American scientists and engineers were scouting throughout Europe, looking at technology. They were amazed by some of the German technology, by the way. And they came to Peenemünde and they found this wind tunnel. The Army Air Corps and the Navy got into a fight over who was going to get the wind tunnel, by the way. The Army Air Corps said, well, we should have precursor to the Air Force. The Army Air Corps said, we should have it. They crated up the whole wind tunnel. The Navy smiled and said, but you don't have any way to get it home. We got a ship. You can't fit this thing on an airplane. So the Navy grabbed it, moved it to what was then the new Naval Ordnance Laboratory, rebuilt that wind tunnel bolt by bolt to exactly resemble the tunnel that von Braun had built. And that became Hypervelocity Wind Tunnel Number 1. Its remains are still on site. The door. My immediate successor as Air Force Chief Scientist was a good friend by the name of Werner Dahm, who's a professor at Arizona State. Werner's father was the aerodynamicist who had worked on that wind tunnel. All right, so that was number 1. And then a succession of wind tunnels were built at that facility, leading to tunnel number 9, which was built in 1976. And it was built to accommodate Navy reentry programs. So in a span of roughly 30 years, we went from tunnel number 1 to tunnel number 9. And now in 2022, tunnel number 9 is still the most modern tunnel that they have. Bottom line, we stopped investing. I'll tell you a similar story with flight testing. I mentioned that X-15 program where they did 199 flights. That was over a period of a decade. So that means that they were flying roughly once every 19 days. Today, our flight test rhythm is roughly once every 6 months. Our success rate in flight test is roughly 50%. Now, I'm the first to tell you we need to take risks, and you need to be willing to fail in flight test. But I'll also tell you there are noble failures where you fail because you didn't know something, you didn't understand something. And then there are the stupid failures, the failures because you didn't engineer it right. A fin falls off, someone doesn't read a checklist. Hate to say it, but a good portion of those flight test failures fall in the latter category, including times when people couldn't read checklists. And why? Simple answer in my mind, we're not doing it often enough. If you want to get good at something, you have to do it often. The contrast, the Chinese are flight testing roughly at 10 times the rate that we are. And their success rate is better than 80% because they do it often. All right, so hopefully I haven't gotten you too depressed because I do want to tell you there is actually some good news in this realm. So in the hypersonics realm, and I want to give tremendous credit to my good friend and colleague, Ellen Lord, because we worked this problem together. There is, frankly, a significant reinvestment in hypersonics. And this shows that when we put our mind to something, we can step up to the plate. If you look at the FIDUP right now, total investment in over the next 5 years, FIDUP is the 5-year budget, roughly $25 billion. That's a lot of funding going into hypersonics. Last year, the General Accounting Office did a survey of the hypersonic programs in the department. They identified 70 separate programs. Every single service, Army, Navy, Air Force, Department of Defense, DARPA, The Test Resource Management Center is investing heavily in new wind tunnels, in new flight test capabilities. So we are stepping up to the plate. A little bit late to the dance, but I have actually a lot of confidence that we are actually getting there. We're seeing a little bit of hand-wringing again about hypersonics. That's something else that happens in the field that limits us. We were going full speed ahead in the area, and now recently we've heard some DoD leadership saying, well, maybe not, maybe we've got some other solutions. No, we don't have other solutions. No, we need to develop this technology, and we need to move full speed forward. Let me also close by mentioning some of our other strengths, and I want to bring it back to, and I'll start with the area of hypersonics, because one of our great assets is that we're pursuing this with friends, partners, and allies. So for example, Australia has been a partner in this field since the late 1990s. Arguably, the Australians flew the first supersonic combustion ramjet. It was a program that was run out of the University of Queensland. They did it for about $1 million, and they did it at the same time that NASA was flying X-43. X-43 was about $300 million, and the Australians scooped them. So it shows you the power of a university. It shows you what a university can do. If you visit the wind tunnel on the top of the roof of the Guggenheim Laboratory building at Caltech, you will find that they have a facility that's called a Stalker tube. It's a type of hypersonic wind tunnel. It was invented by Professor Ray Stalker, who was a professor in Australia. So this is an area that the Australians have been investing in for many, many years, and they're joined at the hip with us, including other countries. And that points to the fact that among our great strengths are our friends, partners, and allies. At the beginning of the talk, I mentioned the fact that we're only about 4% of the world's investment in S&T. And indeed, there's been much press over the fact that the Chinese are stepping up their investments to such a degree that they're closing the gap with us, and they soon could have more S&T investments than us. And then you can get into the argument of whether a dollar in the US buys the same that a dollar in China buys, or yuan in China. And the answer is, well, probably not. They get more for their money right now. And so it looks like we're losing the investment race, except when you add in the investments being made by our friends, partners, and allies. If you look at the list of the big investments being made, the United States is still number one, China's a very close second, but then the next 6 countries on that list, they're all our close friends. And I will submit to you further that I don't actually think the Chinese have friends. They have relationships of convenience, they have business arrangements, but I don't think they have the sorts of friends who share the same goals, the same values that we do, and can work as effectively. So that's one incredible strength. Second incredible strength, it's our universities, and that's why it is so appropriate that we host this meeting here on a university campus. Our universities are still second to none. And most importantly, the best and the brightest from around the world still want to come here. All right, numbers right now are about 20% of the international students who study in a country other than their own come to the United States. Now, why is it important? Well, we're roughly 4% of the world's population. I would argue that means, to first order, we've only got about 4% of the smart people of the world. So we need to bring the best and the brightest minds to our country. And the other good news story about that is the majority of those students who come here want to stay here. They come to the United States and they enjoy our freedoms and the spirit of innovation and the entrepreneurship opportunities that are available, and they want to stay. Overwhelmingly, all right, more than 85% of those international students want to stay here. The impact on defense is incredible. My last year in the Pentagon, I was looking at the awardees for one of our most distinguished fellowships. It's an award that we give to faculty members named for Vannevar Bush, who was the famous science advisor to President Eisenhower. The year that I was overseeing that program, every single one of our faculty recipients was either foreign-born or first generation. And you look back even at mid-20th century. Look at the people who were involved in the Manhattan Project. How many of them were foreign-born and came to our shores seeking freedom and the ability to innovate? So, what that tells us is it's really important we can continue to nurture that, and we make it easier for the best and the brightest to come to the United States. I want to close with another historical example. I mentioned the early American Navy and the early American frigates. For those of you who've been in the Pentagon, and I know a number of people in the audience have been in the Pentagon, you know the Pentagon itself is basically a museum gallery. It's got models, it's got paintings, Incredible artwork. Side note, the Navy's got the best models, but the Air Force has the best paintings. And most of the Navy paintings are of ships being attacked by airplanes. Just gonna put that out there. I have a particular favorite painting though in the Pentagon, and it hangs over in the Navy corridor. And it's not an airplane. It's actually a painting of two ships engaged in a battle. It's the USS United States and the HMS Macedonian. So I want to tell you a little bit about that battle because it's really important to some of the struggles that we face. So War of 1812 opens. The U.S. Navy it has a fledgling Navy, all of 6 frigates. But these frigates, as I mentioned earlier, were absolutely state-of-the-art. They were a generation beyond anything that the British could bring to bear. And they had that technology for a reason. You had smart engineers who looked at how the British Navy and the French Navy and other European navies built their ships. They dissected those ships. They figured out what they were doing right, and more importantly, they figured out what they were doing wrong. And they came up with ship designs that had better structural design, better materials, more armament in every way. First major engagement in the War of 1812, Battle of USS Constitution versus HMS Guerrier. It's one of those moments where, as an engineer, I wish I could have been there. All right, the British captain thought, "Oh, one of those American ships, easy prey. We'll take them 1, 2, 3." That was when the USS Constitution got its nickname "Old Ironsides," because the British discovered that their cannonballs were bouncing off her sides because she was actually made of very, very dense wood, live oak, which the British cannonballs couldn't penetrate. And I've always thought that must have been one of the greatest oak craps in history, as the British commander realized his cannonballs were bouncing off this ship, and it was cruising up, and those gun ports opened, and they let out with a broadside. So that was the first major engagement. British thought it was a fluke. Yeah, the Americans got lucky. Second major engagement, USS United States versus HMS Macedonian. Another one of our 6 frigates. The United States was commanded by a superhero of the day, Stephen Decatur of Decatur House fame, an amazing commander. He had an all-volunteer crew. These folks knew what they were doing. The British commander, John Carden, was a very, very seasoned captain. He also thought he'd make easy work of this British frigate. He was so confident in victory that he raised a barrel of molasses into the rigging, and he says, "Boys, we'll feast on this when the battle is over." Battle was over in 15 minutes, but it didn't go the way he expected. The U.S. was absolutely victorious. Stephen Decatur creamed him. Now, here's what I find amazing about this story. The British commander, Carden, and Stephen Decatur were good friends. In fact, before the War of 1812, the Macedonian had been docked at Norfolk Navy Yard. The 2 ships sat next to each other at the pier. Carden had dinner often on board the USS United States. He saw it all. It was very easy. When you're on board the ship, you could see the different structural design. He saw the wood. He saw the thickness of the walls. He saw the number of guns, and it went right over him. He missed it all. He even said to Stephen Decatur at one point, "Wouldn't it be grand if our 2 ships met on the field of honor?" Yeah, it wasn't so grand for him. I leave you with this thought. Are we at risk of the same? Are we at risk of being confronted with these threats, with these challenges, with adversaries who we maybe dismiss, we don't take seriously? We assume we have such a position of superiority that there's no way they could challenge us until it's too late. And I would submit to you that one of the absolute most important roles for this organization, for this institute, is to make sure that that doesn't happen, that we never lose sight of the fact that we are in a technology race, and that we are constantly having to battle for superiority. And thank you so much for your attention. And I was told that you wanted, did I have time for questions, or?
Yeah, Dr. Lewis, thanks. That was a really inspiring speech that you gave. So since we're sitting here, at a flagship institution, what do you suggest we do on the workforce development side? We know as a state we're continually confronted by companies within the state saying, we need more engineers, we need more, employees in the workforce. How do we jumpstart that so that we can really supply, the engine for the future aerospace defense sector?
So I love that question. And first, let me also mention, I think one of the good news stories that we've seen in recent years is universities such as the University of Oklahoma really stepping up to the plate and acknowledging that defense is absolutely key, absolutely critical. There's a handful of universities where that has occurred. Purdue is one of them, Arizona State, obviously University of Oklahoma. And I'll tell you that that's not something to be taken for granted. I spent most of my career at a university where I will candidly tell you, defense wasn't always welcome. Before the formal kickoff of today's events, I was talking to a colleague about how at one point I did some time off my campus to work with the Air Force, and I came back to my university. And my first week back in my university office, one of my senior colleagues wandered in to kind of chit-chat, and at some point he said, by the way, we all kind of think you wasted your life for the past 4 years. You should have gone to the National Science Foundation if you wanted to work at a federal agency. And that's an attitude you see in a lot of university campuses. And thank God it's an attitude that's changing, and also and to see the leadership of universities that are saying national defense is absolutely key. All right, so with that in mind, I will argue that the challenge isn't that we have a STEM shortage. We're constantly hearing about the STEM shortage, but the reality is we actually don't see the evidence of an across-the-board STEM shortage. Indicators for simple ones like salaries in the STEM fields. I have friends in industry who are always saying, what are you going to do about the STEM shortage? I say, well, are you having trouble hiring? And often the answer is, well, not us, but we hear stories about others. But what I think we do have a shortage in is the best and the brightest who want to work on problems of national defense. And that's where an organization like the University of Oklahoma can really help out. Just having a defense institute, a defense-focused research center is key. Getting students involved in problems, showing them, hey, not only these research areas critical to national defense, but they're also really neat problems. Again, I'll speak as someone who spent most of his life in academia. The problems that I enjoyed working on the most were the ones that were the defense problems, because they were some of the most challenging and some of the most consequential. I'll tell you about an experiment that we started when I was still in the Pentagon. We kicked off, in the area of hypersonics, we kicked off an office called the Joint Hypersonic Transition Office, the JHTO. And one of the key elements of that was a university consortium to work hand in glove with industry and the government. That consortium today is now about 1.5 years old. It's got 100 universities headquartered at Texas A&M, but Purdue is a partner, University of Illinois is a partner, 100 universities. It's been incredibly successful by any metric that I can come up with. But the most important element of that consortium in my mind is every university that signed up to be part of it agreed that there was sensitivity in the subjects that they were working. And so they agreed to some publication review, they agreed to personnel review. Frankly, we're not going to put students from certain countries working on certain problems, and the universities had to agree to it. There were some universities that would not agree to that. And we told them, thank you for your interest in national security. But the ones that would, and it was an overwhelming number, I think that sets a model for how we go forward. It's a delicate balance. You don't want to completely close the doors. Obviously, as I said earlier, we want the best and the brightest to come to our shores. But we also have to be careful about how we manage these projects. And I think we have a vision for how to do that moving forward, building on that consortium model.
Should I go? Okay. Dr. Lewis, thank you so much for that. My name is Lisa Ellman. I'm a partner at Hogan Lovells Law Firm, where I lead our global uncrewed aircraft systems practice, as well as serve as executive director of the Commercial Drone Alliance. So what you described, that was a very enlightening talk that you gave. Really appreciate everything. And what you describe is a technology race. But I would urge that we're also in a policy race with other countries around the world. And there's obviously the civil marketplace feeds into the defense marketplace here. So how can, and I would just, as an example, in the drone use context, the small UAS marketplace is dominated by one Chinese company that has 70% of the market here in the United States. And a big part of that challenge in developing the marketplace here in the US is the regulatory frameworks. Same on the counter drone side. There's no, right now, as we'll talk about in our counter UAS panel, the policies have really lagged behind the pace of technology. So what can we all do together collectively to ensure, recognizing that moving these policy and regulatory frameworks forward is a national security imperative?
So first of all, I agree with you absolutely, and as you probably know, the UAS story is not a good one. I mean, for years we book kept UAVs in the same category as missiles, and the aerospace and engineering me likes to point out, UAVs have landing gear and they generally come back, and so they're not missiles, but it really did have a negative impact on our industry. I'll give you another example that I really worry about. I mentioned microelectronics. So remember, the Department of Defense is a very small purchaser of microelectronics, critical to what the department does, but only about 2% of the microelectronics market in the US is DoD, right? The rest is commercial, or as I like to point out, there are an awful lot more iPhones being built than F-35s. So if you want to get commercial microelectronics into the defense sector, you have to be careful that you don't create collateral barriers. If you're a microelectronics supplier and you find out that by virtue of selling a component to the department, you now can't sell to other users that make up 98% of your business, obviously that's not something you're going to do. So we need to be paying attention to this. So I think there are a couple ways. One, obviously, engagement with policymakers and decision makers, or engagement on the Hill. We need to keep telling them this story. We need really smart, technologically well-versed people explaining some of the nuances. And the problem is that a lot of these issues, there are nuances that get glossed over. So I'll give you my favorite or maybe my least favorite example, and that is the ITAR regulations. So ITAR regulations that restricted overseas sales of certain technologies, created by well-meaning, patriotic Americans who saw a problem and thought they were solving it. Unfortunately, what they also did was create whole industries overseas. When we refuse to sell things to other countries, those countries built up their own capabilities, and in some cases they exceed what we do. If you're going to buy a star tracker now for satellite navigation, the best supplier is a European company, because we wouldn't sell those overseas, they created their own. I had a colleague in India once tell me that the entire Indian aerospace industry depended on ITAR rules, because they could sell stuff to people that we couldn't. So we have to be careful. Right? Obviously there's a balance. There's clearly some technologies we'll never sell overseas, but we have to be very cautious how we proceed. And again, that just requires that all of us who understand this participate in that policy discussion. As a quick advertisement, I'm a big advocate for people in the sciences and engineering and people at universities to do government rotations, to do time in places like the Pentagon and the State Department, and also a really big advocate for having people who are in government coming to universities and bringing that knowledge and that understanding to explain how the processes work, so we get that well-intentioned, we get that advice.
Dr. Lewis, fascinating talk, but I noticed it was really focused very much more on military hardware. Mm-hmm. And I wonder about cyber warfare.
Yeah. And
what are your thoughts about that?
Ooh, so look, obviously cyber warfare is one of our key challenges, right? And the department is investing very heavily in cyber. I have I would have what I described as a somewhat nuanced view of cyber, in that I can't tell you the number of times I would be in meetings in the Pentagon, and Alan, you probably had this experience too, where we got to some insurmountable problem, something we couldn't stop, something we couldn't prevent, and invariably someone in the room said, "Oh, we'll just do left of launch. We'll just hack them before they launch it, and that'll solve the problem." And unless our adversaries are really bad engineers, they're not going to make open up those vulnerabilities. So I think obviously cyber is an arrow in the quiver. It's something that we have to have as a resource. We also need to be guarding against it. We need to be protecting against it. We know we've got competitors who have used cyber already. Much of the story about how the Chinese advanced in hypersonics is a cyber story, right? They stole from us hook, line, and sinker. And the thing to remember about China is, first, there is kind of a seamless overlap between what they call commercial and what they call military. The PLA invests in most of the companies that are tied into their defense sector. But also the Chinese do things that we would never do. For example, their equivalent of the Central Intelligence Agency actually hacks into our companies, steals information, and hands it off to their companies. So, you know, that would be the equivalent of one of our intelligence agencies stealing data from a Chinese company and handing it to Boeing or Lockheed or Northrop. We don't do that. They do. So, but yeah, bottom line, it's obviously a key issue. I can also tell you that almost every weapon system that I was involved in reviewing, invariably we ask the question: how do we make sure we're not vulnerable to cyber attack? And it is indeed at the forefront of every new development system being imagined.
Dr. Lewis, Mike Stice, I'm the Dean of the College of Earth and Energy here at the University of Oklahoma. Just curious what your take is on the race there. I mean, obviously energy technology has played a key role in the historical defense, but I'm curious where we are in that. We talked about Governor Stitt saying we have an all-in energy strategy that began in 2011 here. Where are we federally and internationally?
So I actually think that there's a really good news story on energy, and it really tracks back to the Department of Defense. So I'll tell you a very, very personal view. When at the time that I was the Air Force Chief Scientist, the U.S. Air Force was the single largest user of fossil fuel in the federal government. We had a $7 billion a year fuel bill. So it was larger than the budget of the entire National Science Foundation. So as you can imagine, we were really focused on reducing that bill. I mean, you know, support of the environment is important, but it was just economics. We wanted to get that fuel bill down, and we were exploring a number of technologies, including, you know, synthetic fuels, alternate energy sources. We're very proud of that. And then the other services really stepped up to the plate. I think the Defense Department is in a unique position because we can provide these experimental test beds. Right? We already have examples of compact energy solutions, Navy ships. We have self-contained communities, air bases, Army bases, Navy bases that are ripe for experimentation with energy. And I can tell you there's still a significant amount of work across the board looking at all sectors on increased energy efficiency. I think we're actually in really good measure there. And of course the department is working very closely with the Department of Energy, working close with academia on alternate energy solutions. I'll give you another quick anecdote, which is so at NDIA, in the Emerging Technologies Institute that General Carlisle hired me to kick off. We do a series of podcasts, and we recently did a podcast with the gentleman who's basically overseeing energy for the Air Force. And he was embracing all sorts of interesting solutions, everything from compact nuclear to just building more efficient airplanes. You know, airplanes that have lower drag, higher lift, using novel configurations to get that energy consumption down.
Dr. Lewis, thanks for your talk.
Yep.
I'm Austin Bowman with North Star Scientific. I come from a design engineering background in radar and communications hardware. I've got two questions. First of all, in general, how can we do a better job of preventing other countries from taking advantage of when we invent a technology and someone else implements it? And then my second question, maybe a little bit less thought about, in the areas that we're behind, how can we do things to close the lead and sort of turn the tables? Thank you.
So your first question, that's a really difficult one. Military secrets are often the most fleeting. And we sometimes forget that. You know, I'll give you the example of stealth technology. So we have now been using stealth capabilities for an entire generation. The whole world has had a chance to see how we use stealth. They've been able to build countermeasures and also invest in their own capabilities. And we see Russian fighters, Chinese fighters, for example, that have stealth capabilities, although the degree of their stealthiness is still somewhat questionable. So military secrets, technology secrets are the most fleeting, especially when you demonstrate the technology. So I think the first thing is always staying ahead. It means always investing, always looking at the next capability, always looking over the horizon. And that's something the department does really well. You know, on basic research front, you've got the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, Office of Naval Research, Army Research Office, DARPA, a whole range of organizations that are looking over the horizon. And that's absolutely critical to what the department does. And it's the reason the department invests so much money in that. the services, I know the Air Force number is the best, but the service actually invests 70% of its basic research money outside the Air Force at universities and laboratories around the country because we need to be looking over the horizon. So that's the first thing. Let's see, the second part of your question was?
How can we turn the tables? How can we take advantage of areas in which we're behind and want to close the gap?
So I have no doubt that when this nation puts its mind to something, it can accomplish it. I had a Russian friend once tell me, yeah, we put a ball in space, and next thing you know, we know you Americans are walking on the moon. We saw this in Operation Warp Speed, right? People told us you couldn't have a COVID vaccine in less than 5 years. We did it in months. So when this country puts its mind to something, we absolutely can do it. So the first step is you put your mind to it. I'm told the first step when someone joins Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step is to acknowledge that they're an alcoholic. Well, the first step in solving this problem is to acknowledge we have a problem, to acknowledge that we've fallen behind, and then make the investment and stick to it. If I can use the hypersonic example, one of the other challenges we have faced is every 15 years we've had a boom and bust cycle. We invest heavily, we invest in programs like X-43 and X-51, we stop it, the bottom falls out, we lose the workforce, we lose the capabilities, and then we're reinventing it 5-10 years later. We need to have consistent investments, and we need to have a commitment and an unwavering acknowledgement that this is absolutely critical to the future defense of our nation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lewis, for your remarks, your call to action, and your continued leadership at the Emerging Technologies Institute in support of national security. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a scheduled break here. Please enjoy light snacks and drinks out there, and help us stay on schedule by being back here in this room at 10:30. Thank you.